Hey guys, welcome back to Model Farm Studio. In this video, I'll be building two members of a very unique line of farm machines that were known as Uni-Systems. Uni-Systems were built by New Idea from 1963 until the mid-1990s. The concept revolved around using the same self-propelled power unit to operate a variety of mounted harvest-related attachments. Those attachments range from snowblowers all the way to corn pickers. Minneapolis Moline originally developed this product in what was known as the Uni-Farmer. Uni-Farmer had a Uni-Tractor with a small selection of attachments that could be installed on it. The downside was removing these attachments was very difficult. If you think about it, in the 1950s, not a lot of farmers had access to overhead cranes that could easily lift these attachments off the Uni-Tractor. Fast forward a little bit to 1963, and New Idea acquired the product and the rights to it and redeveloped it from the ground up in what became known as the Uni-System. Over the years when it was produced, it was very successful with smaller operations that had a need for, say, harvesting or chopping silage in the spring and summer, and then maybe picking corn or shelling corn in the fall time frame. For many farm toy collectors, including myself, the Uni-System has been a very sought-after model. Fortunately, thanks to 3D printing, one company, Farm Factor 3D, now provides a kit that we can put together for a Uni-System. Specifically, there are three models that can be built with this kit: a 708, a 709, and an 802. In this video, I'll be assembling two of them, a 709 and an 802, both of which had the Allis-Chalmers engine. If you guys have any questions about anything you see here in the video, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments section below. If you're interested in building your own Uni-System, I've included a link to that in the description section of the video. With that, let's jump into it. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's begin by looking at what was included with each kit. As part of the power unit, we had the main body with some great details. A black breather was also included for alongside the cab. The cab consisted of 7 total pieces: the shell of the sides, a clear plastic vacuum molded insert for the cab glass, a steering wheel and column for it to mount to, the side console and base, a seat, and lastly, the back. The main chassis and front driveline components were part of a single piece that fit underneath the power unit, hence the long rectangular square along the side. 2 3D printed front tires and rims were also included to mount to the axles. Rear axle components enabled the Unis to steer. Each spindle had a ball that mounted into a socket at either end of the tie rod. A small stack of rear weights was included to suggest the counterweight that was needed at the back of the systems in real life. 3D printed rear tires and rims came with each kit to mount on the rear axle. I decided to use these wheels on one Uni to make it look like it had assist, which you'll be seeing a little later in the video. 2 sets of decals were included to complete each machine. 802 decals with AGCO New Idea lettering resembled models with orange cab tops and black cab sides that were built from 1981 to 1982. The other sheet with 708 and 709 decals replicated the earlier orange-sided white top versions built from 1977 to 1980. One of the most popular attachments for Uni-Systems, especially with dairy farmers, was the 767 Superchopper. Here you see one chopper body with numerous intricate details, from pulleys to diamond-plated texture on the side step. A spout for filling wagons or trucks with processed crop was also included with each kit. I like that these spouts had the cross-support bracing underneath them, just like in real life. A small feed roll with teeth and a feeder house table provided even more detail at the throat of the chopper. And lastly, the corn head and the hay head. As you can see, the auger for the hay head was also a separate piece. Decals for these heads and the chopper body were included. The details on these pieces really do a nice job illustrating what can be done with 3D printing. Take note of all the gathering chain fingers on the corn head and the individual pickup teeth on the hay head. This level of detail is excellent, especially considering how challenging these components would be to incorporate from scratch. The most time-intensive part of this entire build was sanding all the parts. More specifically, the printing process left some small nubs or burrs that needed removed. To sand these off, I relied on 2 different items: my set of metal needle files for the initial major sanding and sanding sticks for smoother sanding afterwards. 3D prints are soft, so it's important to remember to focus on sanding as opposed to rushing to get your item sanded. I'll move through this portion rather quickly, but I do want to share a few tips. First, because of the level of detail, it was important to study photos and videos of the real machines before I started sanding. For example, at the back of the unit was the fuel fill cap. I certainly didn't want to mistakenly remove a detail like this, so I referenced plenty of photos and videos for assistance. Sanding was also important to minimize the build lines from the printer. If you look closely at any 3D printed piece, you'll most likely see small lines in it. These can be especially noticeable on large flat surfaces like the corn head. I sand 3D printed items down as best I can before I apply any primer and paint to ensure that both go on as smooth as possible. Having an assortment of files in different shapes and sizes was very useful. For example, a triangular shaped file was great for the rear axle where smaller filing motions were required. In contrast, on a square area like the side of the power unit, a rectangular file was my preferred choice because the flat square end wouldn't jab into the shielding. I like to keep a stiff, thick paintbrush nearby to dust parts off when I'm sanding. For this build, a brush was very handy for pieces like the frame where these little filings found their way into nooks and crannies. The tires in these kits were printed black, which meant they conveniently didn't need painted. I only used sanding sticks to prep these tires because the sidewalls and tread patterns were somewhat thin. In other words, using my needle files could have potentially removed too much material, resulting in a misshapen tire. On the other hand, the rims did require some sanding to fit inside the tires. In this case, I was glad to use my needle files to help me get the job done faster. Cleaning 3D printed parts is crucial before paint. While all of Form Factor 3D's kits are pre-cleaned after printing, prints from other manufacturers can sometimes feel oily or greasy. Over time, these oils can seep through paints and leave a dusty, crystallized look. Nonetheless, despite Form Factor 3D's pre-cleaning, their instructions still advise that parts be cleaned with warm, soapy water. I thought this seemed like a great idea because if nothing else, cleaning them would help remove the tiny filings that I created while sanding. For my process, I used warm, soapy water in the container on the left. To help thoroughly clean the prints, I used a paintbrush with stiff bristles. The center container had warm water to rinse the soap off the prints. Then after they were all washed, I left them dry on a paper towel. There are some other methods developed for cleaning 3D printed parts depending on the type of printed material that you have. For example, some like Form Factor 3D turn to soaking their prints in 91% alcohol. Others rely on a process with dipping their prints in a crockpot of canola oil and then putting them in an acetone bath afterwards. Basically, the hot oil melts the waxy residue and the acetone then removes the canola oil. Most of the time you'll see this method done for prints coming from a company called Shapeways. I do hope to document this last method a little bit more in depth as part of a future video. So while the prints were drying, I addressed the front wheels. I decided not to use the fronts that came with either Uni and instead opted to use some off two John Deere 95 combines. I had to strip the paint off one set of these wheels that underwent some of my weathering attempts from many years ago. To loosen the paint, I soaked them in Purple Power Cleaner, which is considered an industrial strength cleaner and degreaser, much like Simple Green and Super Clean. When it comes to removing paint, model builders often turn to one of these three products. In terms of potency, I would say that Super Clean is the strongest, followed by Purple Power and then Simple Green. You can find these products at a variety of stores, but they're easiest to find at automotive stores. I removed the inner hub of plastic from each rim to help give the Unis the correct stance, especially with the corn heads. To cut these pieces off, I used my number 5 X-Acto knife with a number 235 V-tooth coarse saw blade. I wasn't worried about making these cuts perfect as the inside of the wheel would rarely be seen. At the same time, I had to make sure there was some of this plastic left to give them a little spacing between the frame. To ensure the rims had a snug mount to the axle, I decided to shim them. This required drilling the holes out a little bigger and then inserting 2 pieces of brass tubing. After applying a dab of super glue, I used my brass hammer to seat each piece of tubing. Brass hammers are useful for metalworking because they have a soft head which minimizes damage. Really, if you're considering building these kits, you could completely omit this step by just using the wheels that are provided, but I thought it might be helpful to show how I shim my rims. With the wheels ready, I inserted 2 small pieces of a pin on each side of the front axle. These prints had pilot holes that made drilling with my pin vise quite easy, not to mention the fact that 3D prints are already soft. To secure the pins, I applied a small dab of super glue over the holes and then slid them inside. Both Uni-Systems had cream-colored rims, so I applied some Testor's enamel paint with a brush on both sides. For most projects, I do separate the tire from the rim and then spray paint them. However, I used these John Deere 95 wheels on a previous project and found out that the rib that the tire slides over is rather bulky. Additionally, these tires are rather stiff or hard, which makes remounting them a little challenging, even if they're reheated. As a side note, I like to use a pin to go over the lip of the tire to remove any excess paint before it finishes drying. I applied 2 coats of paint to the front and back of the 3D printed rear rims for the 802. As I mentioned before, this Uni will have the rear assist, while the older 709 will be a 2-wheel drive version. I started on some of the assembly before I sprayed primer and paint. Both power units had flashers mounted on each side of the cab roof. Using my pin vise, I carefully drilled holes, applied some super glue, and then inserted small round flashers made by Moore's Farm Toys. At the back of what was the 709, I installed one floodlight which was also made by Moore's Farm Toys. While looking at photos of real Uni-Systems, it was apparent to me that there were either many different light configurations available or a serious need for farmer-enhanced lighting because there weren't many lights in the same location. However, on 709s it seemed common that one light was mounted on each side of the front cab post, so I added these to mine. In contrast to the 709, the 802 had 4 lights mounted at the top of the cab roof. To make these, I drilled 4 holes in one side of a small piece of angled styrene. I then mounted 4 of the floodlights inside each of the holes, cut off the extra bit of post on the other side, and then sanded the remaining nubs down flush with the styrene. Eventually, I painted this light bar assembly flat black. A handrail to the left of the cab door helped with getting in and out of the machine. I bent some thin wire into shape for both cabs, which ended up sort of resembling a staple, and then attached them with some super glue. The windows to the left and right of the operator's seat could slide open, so I added center posts to both since they were missing. I fashioned these out of scrap styrene that I cut and sanded to fit inside the openings. At this point in the build, I forgot to include these posts in the windows to the right side, but you'll see them installed as we move on. While discussing the cabs, I'll go over assembling a few of the interior components before paint. I drilled out the holes in the steering columns to get the steering wheels to fit, then tacked them in place with some super glue. After that, I attached each column to the holes in their respective floor. So the steering wheels obviously control the rear axles, so we'll move to that portion of the power units next. There were a variety of holes to drill out, including the brackets that each axle mounted to on the frames and on the axles themselves. As I said earlier, these pilot holes really made drilling easy. With the holes drilled out, I was ready to attach the axles to the frames. I just used part of a pin for mine, but you could also use a small piece of wire or brass rod. I drilled out the pilot holes in each steering knuckle. One hole ran through the top to secure the knuckle to the axle, while the other one ran horizontally to attach the wheels. I decided not to attach these to the axle until after paint to ensure that they could easily move for steering. At this point, I was ready to attach the bodies to the chassis. I applied glue on the top of the small arms, around the rectangles on the chassis, to the inside of the engine compartments where the rectangles fit inside, and then put the two pieces together. I chose to install the pre-cleaners at this point, but they could have been painted separately and then put on. These mounted to a hole on the side of the engine compartments and with 2 small posts on the stacks that attach to the back of the cabs. Up next was gluing the back wall of the cabs in place. It was important to check how the sides and interior lined up to ensure that these pieces were positioned correctly. In hindsight, I would have left this piece off the 802 since I had to hand paint a portion of it black alongside the back of the cab. While it wasn't a big deal, it could have saved me a little bit of time. The unis were now ready for primer. I like to apply my primer a little heavier on 3D printed projects to help smooth any remaining build lines. Another option is to use a high build primer, but sometimes that does tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side. After priming, I added a small piece of brass ladder that I forgot to include earlier on the back of the 709. I like keeping some of this ladder handy. It's easy to cut, sand, bend, and has a variety of uses for customizing projects. For instance, when cut and bent correctly, you can use it to easily replicate clutch and brake pedals. With the rest of the components drying, I began working on the 767 Superchoppers and their heads. The small feeder houses attached to the front of each chopper with a pin or piece of wire. Like before, I used my pin vise to carefully drill these holes out. I emphasize the word carefully because the small brackets on the chopper bodies were rather fragile. I also drilled through the entire width of the feeder house tables to run a pin through them. The trick was to make sure the drill bit stayed level the entire time during this step to ensure that it didn't break out the top of the print. After sanding, I installed the feeder house table and the feed roll at the front of the throat. I attached the table with a pin as I previously mentioned, while the feed roll was just glued in place. The hay heads were next for assembly. To install the augers, I just applied 2 small dabs of super glue on each end and then inserted them behind the pickups. After spraying these heads with some primer, I realized that the wind guards above the teeth were missing. I felt like these would really help add some detail to the heads, so I decided to make them out of small brass tubing and styrene rod. To begin, I marked off how long I needed to make each piece of brass based on the width of the heads. After cutting this brass with my tabletop chop saw, I inserted pins in each end. I then trimmed these to fit underneath the sides of the heads. For the individual tines, I used some 219.025-inch styrene rod made by Evergreen Plastic. I marked out the tine spacing on the brass tubing and then glued on the pieces of rod. As you can imagine, this process was rather tedious, so my tweezers were quite helpful for this step. The correct paint for these two Uni-Systems was a shade of orange that new Idea called Bittersweet. I picked up this can from a local AGCO dealer, but it can be rather difficult to find since it hasn't been used for a long time. If you don't have a good source for this paint, or you don't want to purchase an entire can, a similar shade that I recommend is Testor's 1628 Competition Orange. The Bittersweet has a little bit more of a reddish hue to it, but that could be rather difficult to notice if you don't have any means for comparison. All the orange components received 2 coats of paint. Once again, I intentionally applied this a little thicker to smooth the step lines from the printer. I also left the components for the rear axle disassembled to avoid the paint causing them to bind or stick together. A few smaller pieces were painted their respective colors as well. I sprayed the corn heads with metallic silver to help give them a galvanized look. The cab consoles and chairs were hit with some flat black, and lastly, the cab roof on the 709 and the spouts received some off-white that matched the rims. Once these items dried, I added some detail paint to the side consoles first. True to their times, these consoles and the face of the steering column were trimmed in wood grain. To resemble this, I carefully applied a little brown paint to these areas. I used a pin to apply some silver paint for gauges. After the silver dried, I put dabs of black in the center of these dots to resemble their faces. It's hard to imagine these cabs being completely spotless, so I lightly brushed some brown paint on the floors to suggest the operators track some dirt in. Last up for detailing the interiors, I painted the tops of the cushions on the operator seats. In real life, these seats had a mix of interwoven colors, so I applied 2 coats of light gray. Afterwards, I superglued each seat to its respective platform. Moving on now to the 709's side shields around the engine bay, both of these were painted black while the 802's remained orange. Next up, I painted the center panels on the hoods. The hoods also had a black panel on the back of both machines, so I carefully applied some paint there as well. While the black detail paint dried, I shifted my attention to the cabs. Beginning with the 709's, I carefully edged each of the windows with some black paint using a pin to replicate the window gaskets. Amidst this tedious painting, I stopped to add some silver. On the real versions, the windows to the left and right of the operator's seat were able to slide on aluminum tracks. Using a pin, I carefully painted the openings on both cabs, as well as the center posts that I installed. You'll notice the paint difference between the 2 cabs in this segment. 802's had black sides with an orange roof, while 709's had orange sides with a white roof. I painted the 2 work lights on the front of the 709's cab with the black and silver paint while I had them out. While on the subject of lights, I installed the 802's light bar at this point in the build process. I spray painted this black along with a few other items and then tacked it onto the front of the cab with some super glue. I decided to put some TractorFab door latches on the cabs. Each of these sets comes with 3 different styles of latches which are labeled A, B, and C. I used 2 of the A versions for this particular step. Next, the flashers on the sides of the cab roofs got a little fluorescent orange paint. The black panels at the rear of the machines had a single red light for safety purposes. Using my tweezers, I carefully stuck on round red dots which were originally from a set of decals that I had for a semi. Once the flashers dried, I did more detailing with my black and silver paint. I applied a little black to the 709's rear light and around the edges of the flashers. Silver was applied to the stacks and the fuel caps on the rear of the machines. Small windows were located at the back of the machines to assist operators with hooking up wagons if they had the Superchopper attachment installed, or to see how full the grain tank was if they were running a combine harvester. I edged these windows in black like the others to resemble gaskets. Plastic or cab glass was installed after dull coat to ensure that it remained clear. I applied some black on the slots on top of the engine side panels to make them look like they were open for cooling, like on the real machines. As I've shown in some of my other videos, to add some depth, I apply paint a little heavy to areas like these or on solid grills. I then wipe off the excess with my finger, and the remaining paint down in the grooves helps give the appearance that the area I'm painting is open or hollow. 3 filters were incorporated in these prints, so I carefully added some white paint on each of them for some added detail. Now for some weathering, which was my favorite part of this entire build. I have a lot of people ask me about how I weather my projects, so hopefully these next few clips will give some pointers. I started out by adding light brown paint underneath the cabs and steps to suggest a little mud and dust was kicked up from the tires. You have to think carefully when adding mud to customs, specifically about how it sprays or cakes on areas near the wheels while they're in motion. For instance, here by the side of the fender well, I carefully dabbed a few bristles of my brush that had leftover brown paint to suggest that it was flung along the side. To replicate oil around drivelines and engines, soot from exhaust, and just general grime, I ground up some charcoal sticks that were sold for sketching. To apply this powder, I loaded up a thick bristled brush and then applied it to areas on the front axles where oil accumulated over time. I'll use some more of this charcoal powder again later on in the video. Let's jump to detailing and weathering the wheels. Using a pin, I carefully painted the hub in the center of the rims orange, then added a touch of silver on all the lug nuts. I brushed some of the charcoal powder on the back of each wheel to mirror the oil and grime on the front axles. Take note here of how well the charcoal does at really dirtying up the pristine look of these rims. I applied some of the light brown paint to the tires, starting with the sidewalls. After my brush was out of paint, I wiped it off with my finger, moving in the same direction away from the rims. The remaining paint that was left created highlighting, but also dulled the plastic shine on the tires. For the treads, I made sure to get some of the paint down between the lugs where it might not have cleaned out as well. Personally, I find that I like my results a lot better when I go a little lighter than I think I should, especially when I'm trying to make an item look muddy. Lastly, I added some rusty brown paint to the rims to help make them look more used. I used a pin for this step and, once again, lightly wiped paint away with my finger. I focused on the lip or the outermost portion of the rims to suggest that perhaps corn stalks rubbed against them over the years, causing some of the paint to wear away and therefore expose the rims. At this point, I decided to install the front wheels on both machines to help give them better stability. Just like in real life, I found that these units also had a rather odd center of gravity. Now we'll move to the rear tires. If you recall from earlier, each of the spindles had a ball that snapped inside the sockets on the tie rods. I was concerned with getting paint on these, so I carefully taped each ball beforehand. I inserted pins in each of the 802's rear rims to attach the knuckles to. For hubs, I used 1/8 inch round brass tubing that was made by K&S Precision Metals. I painted the 2 pieces of tubing orange, then glued them to the center of each rim. I then applied white putty inside each of them with my X-Acto knife to hide the fact that they were hollow. Once this putty dried, I then sanded it smooth, painted it orange with a brush, and then glued the knuckles onto the pins. The 2-wheel drive wheels for the 709 were a bit more straightforward. I mounted a pair of implement tires made by Moore's Farm Toys to a set of resin cast rims. I glued 2 pins with orange heads inside each of the rims, and then glued the respective knuckles on like I showed previously. Lastly, I added some light and dark brown paints to give these tires and rims the same weathered appearance as the front wheels. Now it was time for some final weathering on the bodies. If you notice the lack of paint on the underside of the chassis, that was actually intentional. For older models like these Uni-Systems, I like to apply some brown on the underside of the frames to simulate rust. When you think about what these machines would be doing, like running through a field of corn stalks, there's a good chance that there's not a whole lot of shiny orange paint left underneath them. I continued with this brown paint on both cab ladders, as well as on the ladder on the back of the 709. I also put a few light streaks of this paint in various spots to simulate rust or where grime dripped down from moisture or condensation over the years. As I said earlier, charcoal is a great product for weathering. I brushed some on the engine bays as well as near the exhaust stacks to create the appearance of soot from the engines. Once I was happy with the weathering and I painted the back pieces of the cabs, I applied dull coat on these items to seal them up and remove the paint's shine. I could finally put the rear wheels on at this point. After drilling the 2 pilot holes and the knuckles out, I secured them to the axles using pins. Only a small dab of superglue was needed underneath each pinhead, as I wanted to avoid accidentally gluing these knuckles to the axles. Once the knuckles were on the respective axles, the tie rods easily snapped on and they were ready to steer. I carefully separated the power unit decals from their backings using a razor blade, then used tweezers to position them in place. On the 709, cream-colored New Idea logos went on both sides of the hood. The 709 model number decals were located below these on the side panels. The 802's decals were all orange and had the AGCO name on them. After I cut these out with my scissors, I lightly went around the edges with an orange Sharpie. I do this to most decals that are printed on white paper to help them blend in a little bit better with the item that they're going on. In other words, if I installed these decals right after cutting them out, you'd see the white outline around each of them. As for the placement of these, the only model number decal on these newer machines was located on the lower right-hand corner of the cab. The second model number decal on these sheets was just an extra. The two larger decals went on the sides of the hood near the rear. I went a step further on the cabs and incorporated some semi-mirrors made by TractorFab. This package contained 2 sets of metal etched mirrors. Each of the mirrors needed bent into the correct shape. I will say that if you don't consider yourself patient or don't feel comfortable with tedious items, you can simply omit this step. After cutting each of these out of the sheet, I removed the round bubble mirrors at the bottom and then bent the arms to shape using some needle nose pliers. You do have to think carefully about whether the mirror you're working on is for the left or right side of the cab, as it does matter. After making these bends, I trimmed the arms down to ensure that they didn't stick out too far when mounted on the cabs. Once I was happy with them, I used my Dremel tool to carefully smooth out any remaining nubs that were unable to be cut clean. I tacked the mirrors on the side of the cabs using some super glue at the end of each post or arm. Before connecting these, I made sure that all of the arms were positioned so that each of them had contact with the cabs. For a few of them, I used a pin to apply some additional glue to make sure that they were connected as securely as possible. I also used windshield wipers that were made by TractorFab. Using a pin, once again I applied a small dab of glue at the center of the top of the cabs. Then, using my tweezers, I carefully positioned each wiper in place. The cabs were about finished at this point. The 802 received a Uni-System decal on the lower front cab panel. Like the orange decals that I installed on the sides of the hood earlier, I also went around the edge of this decal, except this time with a black Sharpie. The 709's cab received a classic white oval New Idea decal on the front, which I picked up from Boston Implement. The clear plastic vacuum molded inserts for the cab glass were a little challenging to install. I ended up trimming these pieces down and sanded the rear cab panels. I also wanted to avoid supergluing these inside the cabs due to the risk of the plastic fogging up as it dried. So I applied some white oberst glue to the inside corners of the cab to tack the inserts in place for installation, which ended up working quite well. Since the unis were about finished at this point, I felt it was safe to install the windows. I used a thin sheet of clear styrene to make these, but you could also use a piece of blister pack as well. Like the other cab glass, I used Elmer's glue to hold these in place. Once the glue dried, I went around the windows with some black paint to blend in the edges. In hindsight, as I mentioned previously, installing the rear cab panels after paint would have allowed me to put these windows on the inside of the cabs instead of on the outside like you see here. Once the windows were secured in place, I used a small amount of super glue to attach the cabs to the frames. I was strategic with where I applied glue, putting it only on the top of the cab platform and on the bottom of the roof so that it wouldn't be visible. That wrapped up the power units, but there was still minor work needed on the Superchoppers and their heads. I added some of the brown rust-colored paint on the undersides of the Superchoppers. Once upright, I painted around the feeder houses to reflect wear from years of chopping. Specifically, I added this paint down between the bars on the tables and on the feed rolls at the top. I then lightly streaked areas that were subject to losing paint, like sharp edges, pulleys, and various linkages. As I showed earlier with the power units, I brushed some of the charcoal dust on after the paint was dry. Because these choppers would be shown mostly in use, I added a little silver to areas that might be shined up from material like corn stalks and hay going through. These spots were the bars on the feeder house tables and the small teeth on the feed rolls. I carefully cut out the decals and applied them with my tweezers. These only went on the side of the chopper bodies that was visible when they were installed on the power units. The Superchopper decals went on the side panels behind the feeder houses, and the small 767 decals were applied near the spouts. I also put an oval new Idea decal on the rear panels, like the one that I put on the front of the 709's cab. To show wear from material passing through them, I added some rusty brown paint to the undersides of both spouts. Now it was time to work on the corn heads. The bottom steel components on these heads were orange, so I sprayed some Bittersweet paint into a container and applied 2 coats with a brush. One of my favorite details on these kits were the fingers on these heads, which I painted black. Galvanized metal was commonly used to build farm equipment when these machines were built. However, while it was tough in rough farming conditions, that didn't mean it was rust-proof. If you look closely at these heads in real life, they often have rust spots from corn stalks rubbing against them over the years. To show this rust, I applied some of the dark brown paint with a pen. I focused on the edges of the snouts where corn passed as it entered the Superchoppers. I also used a brush to apply brown on the tips of the snouts as well as underneath them. Orange side decals with 768 WN lettering were included. I carefully cut these out, separated them with a razor blade, and then applied them to the sides with my tweezers. I included 2 small caution labels that were from a larger set of warning decals sold by Boston Implement. As I showed earlier when I installed the decals on the power units, I edged all these with a black Sharpie to prevent any white from showing. Now for the hay heads. My plan was to replicate that the head for the 709 was still in use, while the 802's was possibly junked in a fence row. For the 709's, I applied a light coat of silver to the head in spots that were subject to high use, like the center of the pickup and the auger. I then went back and added some dark brown over this silver paint to resemble newer rust. At the same time, I also added some of this brown paint underneath them, like I did on the Superchoppers and the power units. Once this paint dried, I went back with some silver on a pin to highlight newer wear. I felt like this combination ultimately gave the head a really nice look of being tired, but still in use. As I said previously, the 802's head was supposed to look junked, so that meant it needed to have the opposite appearance or not shined up. I skipped the silver and went right to brushing on the dark brown and high wear spots that were now rusted over. To provide a clue as to when the head was last operated, I tucked a little dead-looking static grass in the corners around the auger. I just applied a little white glue and then sprinkled the grass in place with my tweezers. The last step was to brush on some charcoal to dull the paint, but also provide the appearance of grime from sitting out in the elements. As a final step, I applied oval decals on both sides of these heads. That concludes my build process for these 2 new Idea Uni-Systems. As I said in the introduction, Uni-Systems have been highly sought after items for many farm toy enthusiasts like myself, so I'm thrilled to finally have one for my collection. The 802 now lives on my friend Doug's diorama, Simon Family Farms, so you might see it from time to time in some of his Instagram posts. Farm Factor 3D did a great job with these kits, and I was very impressed by their level of quality and detail. If you're interested in checking out more kits made by Farm Factor 3D, I've included a link in the description section of this video. They've got a really nice selection of items ranging from barn fans to hay mergers. Hope you guys enjoyed this build. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, thanks for stopping by.